Use this video to create a quick summary sheet of the highlights for the 4 different tissue types. So take a piece of paper, fold it into 4 blocks, and we will fill in 1 tissue type per block. So by the end of this video, you will have a full-size sheet of paper with the highlights for each of the tissue types. Keep in mind, we will not be covering every detail. So our first tissue type is muscular tissue. The one thing muscular tissue can do that other tissue types cannot is that it can contract. There are 3 different tissue types within muscular tissue. We have smooth tissue, or smooth muscle. When we look at smooth muscle, the cells are elongated and tapered at the ends with a single nucleus. They are not striated, meaning they do not have a striped appearance to them under the microscope. They are involuntary, meaning you do not consciously control them. They are found in the walls of hollow organs or tubes, so that would include your digestive tract, your reproductive tract, blood vessels, and so on. The function for smooth muscle is to essentially move things along. Now keep in mind, in the case of the digestive tract, it helps to move food along. In your reproductive tract, it moves the baby out during childbirth. But in the case of the circulatory system, it doesn't push the blood forward. In actuality, it helps to restrict blood flow to particular areas, therefore directing blood flow into the areas you want. Next, we have cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle cells are branched and have a single nucleus. These are striated cells, so they do have a striped appearance under the microscope. They also have special structures between the cells called intercalated discs. These allow for rapid communication between the cells, so these cells can contract as one. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart, and it is also self-stimulating, meaning that you can remove the heart from the body and it will continue to beat for a period of time. The function of the cardiac muscle is to pump blood, therefore transporting molecules and substances around the body, and also to help maintain blood pressure. The last muscle type is skeletal muscle. These cells are elongated, like long rods, and have multiple nuclei. Now they have multiple nuclei because these cells are very long and are in fact as long as the muscles they are in. So you can have a muscle cell that is more than a foot long. They are striated, so they have a striped appearance under the microscope. As you can guess by their name, they are attached to bones in general, and their function is pretty diverse. They're used for movement, generating heat, helping with posture or stability of the body, protecting internal organs, helping to guard your entrances and exits. So these are particularly important during potty training. And I would argue you should also put in here that they are important for communication, because we use our skeletal muscles to change our facial expressions, and we do a significant amount of communication with other individuals that is nonverbal. Our next tissue type is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is special because it can conduct electricity. We call these electrical impulses action potentials, and we will get into those in a lot more detail when we get to nervous system. About 98% of your nervous tissue is found in the central nervous system, which is made up of your brain and spinal cord, while 2% of your nervous tissue is found in the peripheral nervous system. So those are the nerves branching off of the brain and spinal cord. We have two main types of cells: neurons, which send electricity, and neuroglia, or glial cells, which basically support the neurons. And there are a wide variety of types of neuroglia, which we will also get into more detail when we get to nervous system. If we look at a basic neuron, you can list out all the different parts of the cell and what they do, but I find it's easier just to draw one and label it. So when we draw out our basic neuron, we're going to have these little spiky things on one end and what look like fingers on the other end. So the spiky things at the left side here are the dendrites, and they are going to receive the signal. Then you have the cell body, also known as the soma, which contains the nucleus. Then we have the axon, which carries that signal to the next cell, and the axon terminals that will actually connect to those cells. The arrow represents the direction of that action potential moving down the neuron. And it conducts this action potential by moving ions across the membrane. You do not need to know the specific ions at this point, but we will get into that later. In addition, the nervous system uses chemicals called neurotransmitters, which are actually released by the axon terminals to signal the next cell. A former student of mine had a really good analogy when you look at a neuron. If you think of the axon terminals as looking like fingers at the end of an arm, you could think of that action potential as traveling down that arm like electricity, and then you are a magician shooting electricity out your fingertips. Now, some axons have cells wrapped around them, and we call these structures, when they are wrapped around that axon, a myelin sheath, which creates insulation around that neuron so that your action potential can travel faster. And it does so by only allowing ions to move across the membrane at spaces between those cells called nodes. Our third tissue type is called epithelial tissue. Now, epithelial tissue is found lining or covering pretty much everything in the body. When we look at epithelial tissue, what makes it unique is that we have two distinct surfaces. There's a surface that may have structures attached to it, and that surface is called the apical or free surface, and it's an open surface, like the surface of your skin or the inside of your stomach cavity. And then the other surface is the basement membrane, where that epithelial tissue is anchored to underlying tissues. Because epithelial tissue has an open surface that is constantly being abraded, we need stem cells to continually replace that epithelial tissue. Now, there are lots of different types of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is categorized based on the number of layers and the shape of those cells. We are not going to be able to fit all the different kinds here, so we're going to focus on some of the most common ones in the body for this summary sheet. First, we have simple squamous cells, or simple squamous cells. These are flat cells that are very good at allowing filtration or diffusion across them. So we're going to find these in places like the lungs, where we need to do gas exchange, or the capillaries where we need to exchange nutrients and gases with the cells. We have simple cuboidal cells that look like little cubes or boxes. And these are really good at secreting things. Keep in mind these different tissues can do different things other than what we are covering, but we're trying to keep things simple here. So since I think of these like little boxes, I like to think of them like little water balloons that are good at squirting stuff out. So that might help you remember that they secrete things. So we're going to find simple cuboidal cells in places like glands. There are two main kinds of glands: exocrine glands, which secrete stuff out of the body like sweat, oil, milk, or other substances. And we have endocrine glands, which send their secretions through ductwork into the body or into cavities within the body, and they secrete hormones. Then we have these tall, column-shaped cells, which most often we have simple columnar, but you can have pseudostratified columnar or stratified columnar. Now, columnar epithelium is special because it may have these structures on the surface, like these tall things that wave back and forth, or the shorter structures that do not move at all. We also can have odd-shaped cells that secrete stuff. Now, the short structures that do not move are called microvilli, and they increase the surface area so I can absorb more molecules. The ones that wave back and forth are called cilia, so they help to move stuff across the surface of the cell. The special cells that secrete are called goblet cells, and they secrete gobs of mucus. So what we're looking at here is simple columnar epithelium. It may have, as I mentioned, microvilli that increase the surface area for absorption. So we're going to find those in the small intestine. Or you may have cilia, which wave back and forth to move things across the surface of the cell. So we may find these in the respiratory tract, helping to move mucus-laden particles out. Or in the reproductive tract, helping to move the oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. Or helping to move cerebrospinal fluid around the cranial cavity and dorsal cavity. Now we can have multiple layers of squamous, cuboidal, or columnar cells. If we do, we call that stratified. A good example of that would be stratified squamous, which is really good at protecting, so it helps to keep stuff in and out. And a good example of that would be your skin, and then also folding into your openings, like your oral cavity, vaginal canal, or rectum. We can also have transitional epithelium, which is very stretchy. So we find that in the urinary bladder because it needs to change shape and increase and decrease in volume multiple times throughout the day. Keep in mind there are other types of epithelium, so make sure this is just your starting point for review. And our last tissue type to review is connective tissue. Now, connective tissue, by its name, obviously connects structures. Connective tissue is special because it has lots of matrix, meaning it has lots of stuff surrounding the cells. That stuff can be very watery or it can be very hard. We have three main types of connective tissue. We have connective tissue proper, and we can break that down into loose or dense connective tissue proper. A good example of loose would be adipose or fat tissue, which stores long-term energy stores. Or dense connective tissue, which is rope or sheet-like, and those would include things like tendons, which connect muscle to bone, or ligaments, which connect bone to bone. Or we can have sheets of connective tissue called aponeuroses, or fascia, which is important because you have lots of fascia throughout the body, and you can get fasciitis, or inflammation in the fascia, just like you can get inflammation in other tissues. We also have fluid connective tissue. Those would include lymph. Remember that lymph was extracellular fluid surrounding the cells that diffused into the lymphatic vessels. We then called it lymph, and it traveled through lymph nodes to get checked out for anything foreign, and then eventually would be dumped back into the circulatory system to become part of your plasma. And then we have blood, which, as we know, is important for transporting substances throughout the body. The last category of connective tissue is supportive connective tissue. Now, there are two main kinds here. We have cartilage and bone. Within cartilage, we have three types. Hyaline cartilage, which is the most common type of cartilage, and it makes up most of the embryonic skeleton, and then in adults, it's left over at the ends of those bones. We also have fibrous cartilage, which is tougher, so we find it in places that deal with a lot of stress, like intervertebral discs or your knees. And lastly, we have elastic cartilage, which is very rubbery and stretchy, like the name. So we find it in places like the external ear or the epiglottis. And then lastly, we have bone. Now, we're going to learn a lot more about this when we get to skeletal system, but bone is important for protection, storing calcium and other minerals, providing support for the body, blood production, fat stores, and also leverage for muscles so that you can move. Keep in mind, bone itself does not move your body, it merely provides leverage. And then, of course, during the lecture, we talked about three different types of fibers found in connective tissue: collagen, reticular, and elastic.